So what's your name?
I'm Kole.
Cole.
Where you? The road or the department store.
Where are you from?
I'm from New Orleans, Louisiana. Before I moved here to Boise, I worked with Louisiana State Medicaid, the Director of Health and Hospitals. Here they just call it Health and Welfare, but over there we have DHH, Department of Health and Hospitals. Bruce Greenspan was the director back then. After our DSP, our direct service provider through Medicaid waiver services, experienced licensure issues with the state, I had the opportunity to move here after my folks figured I was going to be unemployable.
And what brought you here?
I had the opportunity to move. My folks thought primarily based on my age, but on a couple of other demographic characteristics, that I'd be a good candidate to be a good homeless person here. Mostly because I'm self-ambulatory also in addition to my age, which just means that I don't require medical equipment to get around, and that I can get from point A to point B pretty good. And with close correspondentship then, I can similarly relate to a 20-something at my age and a 60-something-year-old person with some good equanimity.
Cool, so it sounds like you're very adaptable, and that's...
Mostly.
Okay.
Yeah, based on age primarily.
What would you say are some of the biggest barriers you faced or biggest difficulties being homeless?
Being homeless, there's a stigma attached to homeless culture, access issue to reliable transportation, the irregular hygiene issues, and the propensity or affinity towards mental illness. Approximately 50% or upwards experience some symptoms of mental illness and show some social inadequacy or incompatibility. For me, that hasn't really been the case, but I've still experienced some stigmatization of those three factors.
Could you talk about that a little?
Yeah, well, before I worked in Medicaid in Louisiana and in New Orleans, I lived close to the campus of LSU, which is on the east side now of Baton Rouge. So I lived on the east side of Baton Rouge, but I worked on the west bank of New Orleans during the Medicaid gig. I actually had a very healthy career before the economy bottomed out in 2008. And when I did that, I was primarily responsible for identifying demographic characteristics of a given population of people that allowed us to target market for corporate entities that were looking to market more effectively. And when I say that, the data mining process usually entails that if you can count to more than 1 or 2 points of data, and you'll hear me back on this, that after age being the first characteristic that maintained my own candidacy to be a good homeless person, that in addition to counting on that first one, that is a data miner that once you count past the second fact, in my case for homelessness, I counted access to reliable transportation first and irregular hygiene. That then after you count to the third point for a data miner, it's kind of a wash, because most data miners hold some consensus that you don't count past the second variable, and that once you count the third variable, it's kind of dicey.
And how do you get around the hygiene issue?
Well, it's different these days because of the social distancing order that's been mandated both by the mayor now, Lauren McLean, as well as the stay-at-home order that originated back in March through the governor, or handed down from, as a matter of fact, a couple days ago. He spoke on that since Thursday's the day he likes to talk, so that it can come out before the additional public releases can arrive before the weekend edition of the newspaper. He just spoke on it. But the reason that makes hygiene different these days is that as opposed to relying on public facilities where I can walk in with some close concert or close concord with other folks that are going to the store or that have a public facility, instead I have to rely on using bottled water primarily. But the way that I was taken to school with that is that a little soap and a little water makes the best, makes everything hunky-dory as long as you have soap and water.
And what's been your experience with social work or social services?
I haven't had any. It's interesting that way because I spoke to Medicaid, the topic of Medicaid earlier, which is the NAICS, North American Industrial Classification System, industrial subsector that I earned my income from before I moved here. My experience with social services, now that my direct service provider that I worked for as a direct report to the CEO, I was like a executive assistant before I moved here. Now that I'm here in Boise, my experience with social services is that I receive family supports, but in light of the fact that I receive family supports and have loot, I have money, I have effective buying income, or I have disposable income, I don't receive community supports that would arrive traditionally through the church or the police department, and I don't receive social supports. So on a very fundamental level, I rely on my family.
Would you ever go back to New Orleans?
Absolutely, I recommend it to all my neighbors. The LSU Tigers just had their collegiate deal. Drew Brees is getting old, but it's only been a few years since we took home a Super Bowl. Mardi Gras is the chief attraction there that draws people and draws a crowd there in New Orleans. But the reason why I personally like to recommend traveling to New Orleans for most of my neighbors is that nobody eats like us, nobody drinks like us. There's actually a high incidence of stomach cancer to the extent that we're all kind of gluttons for punishment there. Mm-hmm. But in addition to that aspect of life, nobody really talks or dances, or it's perhaps the most Parisian and the most European city in the contiguous 48.
Cool. Have you noticed a difference in like services or just like how you're treated here compared to New Orleans or another city?
It's different. It's interesting for me because the South, or the Mississippi Delta, the bottom of the Mississippi River, is where I spent the most amount of my years. But here in the Pacific Northwest, it's where I've experienced the fewest. Of course, now that I've been homeless here for 10 years, I can consider myself a local. So it is different. There's a larger Canadian aspect here, but previous to me holding tenureship here or becoming a local here, the only Canadian cultural correspondence I kept was spending a couple cheap spring breaks in Montreal, which is kind of the other side. When the other kids went to Mexico, I went to Montreal for spring break.
Mm-hmm. And how are social services around here? Have you had a good experience?
Mostly, yeah. With the one caveat or the one stipulation then, that when social services are offered to a homeless person, it's based on the general premise that homeless people are needy and that you need something first. And once it's identifiable, in fact, that a homeless person's needy, then social services kind of holds the homeless person at odds with their ability to be self-sustaining, and makes that they kind of encourage a dependency that wouldn't exist if the homeless person raised their hand and said that they needed something. There was a local story I liked about a homeless kid here who graduated from high school just a few years ago. And whenever social services asked him if he needed anything, he would answer no. And somehow he made it, even though he was kind of gaming the system in the sense that he was homeless and still attempting to graduate from a traditional high school environment. But when encouraged by social services to voice for his own dependency, he simply said no. And after I saw that story a few years ago, it kind of reinforced for me the aspect that if a homeless person treats things with treats situational ethics with a lack of urgency, or doesn't determine themselves needy through panhandling or through the self-advocacy for social services, that they don't maintain the same disadvantage as homeless people that are encouraged to be dependent on social services.